each and every one of you. I'd encourage you to open up in your Bibles to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 4 was where we'll begin. We'll drift quickly into Acts chapter 5, but we're going to start off with Acts chapter 4 as we explore some themes that will hopefully be a little less intense than they were last week. Last week we discussed some very intense type of ideas. We discussed the subject of social drinking, and that was obviously a very intense type of sermon. We're going to scale it back a little bit, not in gospel accuracy, not in Bible at all, but just in a little bit of terms of intensity. We're going to look at a story that's actually very intense in its own right. In Acts chapter 5, the story of Ananias and Sappharia. We're going to examine that from a couple different perspectives. It's nothing that I don't think anybody's heard. And I say that to say I don't think that this is a story that's unfamiliar to a lot of us. I think most of us have heard the story of Ananias and Sappharia probably from the time period when we were first starting a Bible class. And so this is a story that probably is not unfamiliar to a lot of us, but hopefully we'll examine it from a couple different angles, drive some applications that will be very personal in nature for all of us. I do appreciate John for leading singing, for the good song that he did, the rest of the men who took part in our worship service. We're very blessed here at Hillside to have an abundance, a cornucopia, if you will, of men that are willing to lead, that can lead, and that offer to lead on very different or multiple occasions. We have very skilled men here that jump at the chance to do something, and so we're thankful for all of them. We're thankful for John for his leadership in song this morning. If you were to trace the history of the early church, starting in Acts chapter 1, or if you were to trace rather the story of Acts, and the church obviously begins in chapter 2, the story of Acts up until chapter 5 is actually very glowing. If you were to look at chapter 1, you would see kind of this story where Jesus ascends up into heaven. And so you have this grand scene where Jesus is ascending back up into heaven outside of Jerusalem. All the apostles are gazing up at him. And then the angels come down, they say, well, don't gaze up in there, because the same way that he ascended, he's also going to descend, talking about the eventual return of Christ that all of us are anxiously looking forward to. You get to chapter 2, you can see the start of the church itself. You have the grand scene on Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles in the upper room. They then filter out into the court of the temple, where all the people are looking at them and they're preaching the gospel, and all these people hear them in their different languages and all their different tongues. And Peter preaches one of the most, probably if not the most convicting sermon that has ever been preached, because the response of 3,000 people then want to put on Christ in the waters of baptism. The church begins there in chapter 2. You move to chapter 3 and you have Peter and John healing the lame man at the gate called Beautiful. And that's one of the first times where you see Peter and John, really the apostles, coming into their own. Now they're starting their own men. They're trying to evangelize. They're trying to spread the good news of Christ. And that authority stamp on healing the lame man in chapter 4 is a very definitive mark on the mindset of the apostles. Moving to chapter 4, after the church has then grown to 5,000 people, Peter and John are before the Sanhedrin giving a very powerful testimony, and then they end up with all the other saints in Jerusalem praying, and the room is shaken because of the boldness of their prayer, because of the boldness that God has given to them. Chapter 4 ends with a very encouraging note. If you would look at Acts the 4th chapter, starting in verse 32, it ends on a very encouraging type of note. It says, the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and of one soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own. That's a very powerful statement. But all things were common property to them. And with great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Abundant grace was upon them all. You can see that in chapters 3 and early part of chapter 4. For there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. What you're looking at here in Acts chapter 4 is not this socialistic type of system where everybody is exactly the same across the board, where you have X number of dollars, X number of possessions, and every single person is the same. That's not what you're looking at in Acts the 4th chapter. What you're looking at is an environment where there's nobody amongst this number that is in abject poverty, and then you have the other side of the spectrum where people are just completely rich. Everybody across the board has at least the basic necessities to take care of them for the time being. And so you may have people that are super rich. The other side of the spectrum is the one that's really in view here. Because you don't have any part of the members of Christ that are out begging. You don't have any of them that are on the streets. You don't have any of them that are in want for anything. All things in common means that they've shared to each one of them as anyone would have need. Saints helping saints, which is still the biblical model today. Verse 36 is where you see a very good illustration of this with Barnabas. Now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means sons of encouragement, and who owned a tract of land, sold it and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. In the midst of all of this great outpouring of love in the community that all of these people have, you have Barnabas. And this won't be the last time you'll see him in Scripture, but you have Barnabas coming to the forefront, having this huge tract of land wherever he got it, and he sold it, and he laid all the money at the apostles' feet. And the thing that's in view of that, and this is a theme that we'll revisit several times throughout the course of this morning, The theme that's in view here is that he gave everything. Notice there wasn't a dollar amount. I understand that they used denarii. There wasn't a denarii amount. There wasn't this number that was placed on there that said he gave this, and that's what was wonderful. The simple term that's used is he gave all. And that's the important thing that's really in view here. Because after you get through chapters 1 through 4 with this glowing scene about the church, that's when you encounter Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sappharia. And a stark contrast to the end of chapter 4 and the great example that Barnabas has. In Acts chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, "But a man named Ananias with his wife Sappharia sold a piece of property, kept back some of the price for himself with his wife's full knowledge. And bringing a portion of it, he laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter then said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit, to keep back some of the price of the land? For while it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not still under your control? Why is it that you have conceived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God." Verse 5, as he heard these words, Ananias fell down and breathed his last, and great fear came over all who heard of it. The young men got up and covered him, and after carrying him out, they buried him. Now verse 7. There elapsed an interval of about 3 hours. His wife came in, not knowing what had happened, and Peter responded to her, "Tell me whether you sold the land for such and such a price." And she said back to him, "Yes, that was the price." Then Peter said to her, "Why is it that you have agreed together?" Notice the injunction of that word, the inclusion of that word. "To put the Spirit of the Lord to the test. Behold, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out as well." And immediately she fell at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead. They carried her out and buried her beside her husband. And great fear came upon the whole church and over all who heard of these things. The story of Ananias and Sappharia, as we just mentioned, is a very interesting story, because it's in stark contrast to everything that you read about in the book of Acts up to that point. Up until Ananias and Sappharia happened, you have a great outpouring of love, you have all things in common, you have this really strong community that exists within the early church. And then Ananias and Sappharia come in and ruin everything. With their greed, with their lies, with their deception, and most importantly, with their selfishness. And the most alarming thing about this story is not the sin that took place, even though that is absolutely alarming. The most alarming thing about the story is the response to it. Because if you didn't know any better, you were just reading Acts chapter 5, you would think you were reading this out of something from the Old Testament. So anybody that tells you that the God of the Old Testament doesn't exist, or that it changes, or whatever, that he changed when we went to the New Testament, that's just not true. Because the punishment that you find with Ananias and Sappharia was very Old Testament-esque. Where you have somebody who commits a sin, who has this wrongdoing, does this iniquity, and then falls dead on the spot. And the impact was unmistakable. Because as these people fall down on the spot, it says there in verses 10 and 11, that great fear went throughout all the church. People were very well aware of what had happened. And they were very well aware of God's holiness and His justice and His judgment, at least at that point. And I think whenever we look at this story, we look at it very innocently, the same way that we look at Galatians 2 with Peter and Paul, and we think to ourselves, why is this such a big deal? I understand that they didn't give all the land, or they didn't give all the money, but why is that such a big deal? The truth of the matter is, that wasn't the big deal. If Ananias and Sappharia had said to themselves, we are going to sell this land, I'm just going to pull, I don't know what the price of land goes for these days, everybody else can educate me, but let's say I'm going to sell an acre, it's going to be grossly overestimated, I'm going to buy an acre for $100,000, I'm going to sell an acre for $100,000. If you're paying $100,000 for an acre, please go back to your realtor and renegotiate that deal. That sounds awesome, that sounds outrageous. But let's say we're going to sell this acre of land for $100,000. And if these people had got together, Ananias and Sappharia said, we only want to give 75% of it, $75,000, still a gargantuan sum of money, and gone to the apostles and said, look, we sold it for this much, we're giving you 3/4 of it, that's what we want to do. Everything, at least in my opinion, I may be mistaken on this, everything would have been fine. But the problem was that they took this chunk of land, they sold it, they came, and looking at what Barnabas had done, they said to themselves, we have given everything. Look at how great we are. And because of that, they were struck down on the spot as a result of that. And that's where the real sin played. That's where the real sin came out. I don't want to mistake anybody. When the title of the sermon this morning, I'm sure you saw it, The Real Sin of Ananias and Sappharia, I don't want to overlook that fact. The real sin of Ananias and Sappharia was their greed, was their deception, was their bloated perception of who they were and their own holiness. I'm not skipping over that. What I want to do this morning is go a little bit deeper than that. Because I think sometimes we're looking at Ananias and Sappharia and we think, well, this was an extreme example. This will never happen in today's world. And what we don't need to make the mistake of thinking is that just because God doesn't strike us down on the spot for our sins does not mean He approves of it. You have a perfect example here in Acts chapter 5 of somebody doing something wrong, the judgment is pronounced on them, and their punishment is delivered instantly. We don't, and thanks be to God, have punishments, at least to my knowledge, doled out instantaneously like Ananias and Sappharia did. But we cannot get into the habit, or we cannot fall into the false sense of security of thinking that just because God hasn't struck us down for something on the spot, means that He's okay with us. It means that He's okay with that. And sometimes that's where our minds go. If you look in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, notice what Peter has to say in this chapter about this very idea. 2 Peter chapter 3, he's discussing the end of time. And this is the destruction of mankind when God comes back and issues judgment, those who are faithful unto eternal life and those who are not faithful unto destruction. 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 3, talks about this idea. He says here in verse 3, know this first of all. This is in direct conversation with people who would deny this type of thing. He says, know this first of all. Take it to the bank, that in the last days mockers will come with their mock. And they will say, after falling after their own lust, where is the promise of His coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. The logical fallacy of that is, they're going to continue saying that until He comes. And then it'll be too late. So you can say that up until the event happens. That's the logical fallacy of that. But look what he mentions here in verse 5. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, the earth was formed out of water and by water, you can tell where he's going with this, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by His word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Here's the teaching in verses 8 and 9. Do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Verse 9, the Lord is not slow about His promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. The reason that you and I are alive to this day, the reason that we are here alive in this moment of time, July 23rd, if I've got that date right, of 2017, even though we've sinned, take this to the bank, it's because God is patient with every one of us. God is not looking at our sins, and just because He hasn't killed us for them, looking at them in manners of approval. It's not like He's looking at something that I've done 5 or 6 years ago, or 5 or 6 minutes ago, whatever you want to say, that was sinful, and if nothing happens to me, God's okay with that. The reason He hasn't struck me down is because He's patient, hoping that I will repent. And we can't ever mistake that fact for the idea that God approves of all these different types of things. And so what Ananias and Sappharia does for us in Acts chapter 5, it gives us a very real understanding of God's judgment, of God's justice, and just how seriously He considers His own name. When we talk about Ananias and Sapphira's real main sin, when we talk about their main sin, we put the greed, the selfishness, the bloated perception of the self, we put all of that under the idea. Their true sin, when it comes really down to it, was vanity. They did not understand what sacrifice was all about. They did not understand what their whole shape or what their whole role in this early church was about. They viewed the early church as being a means to an end by saying to themselves, this church can serve me rather than me serving them. And that was the fundamental sin. When you put all of this up against each other, that was the fundamental sin of all of this. And a very interesting competing analysis. Look at Mark chapter 12. You see kind of the opposite happening here in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 41. Let's go back to the time of Jesus, where He's watching all of the Pharisees and all the people who really trusted in themselves that they were worth something. And in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 41, it says, He sat down opposite the treasury, He being Jesus, and He began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury. And many rich people were putting in large sums, and there's nothing wrong with that. A poor widow, though, however, verse 42, came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amount to a cent. And calling His disciples to them, said to them, Truly I say to you, this poor woman put in more than all the contributors of the treasury, for they all put in out of their surplus, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she owned, all that she had to live on. The emphasis here is not on the rich people. That's not what He's talking about. He's not as if He's saying, talking about the widow, that He's saying all these other people were sinful because they put in 1,000 times what the widow did. That's not what His point is. The point is, at the end of the day, those rich people who put in
thousands, who put in hundreds of thousands, or whatever it was, that put that into there, they still had something to go back to. And at the end of the day, the widow put in every single last cent that she had. Everything that she had to own, she put in that plate and went on about her life. That's the true nature of sacrifice. Because when we talk about sacrifice, we're not talking about, I'm just giving up a little bit here, just giving up a little bit here. It is literally you taking a piece of something that you need or something that you desire, and you are laying it on the altar for something else entirely. Ananias and Sappharia didn't do that. When they looked at this tract of money, they sold everything, they put it in the treasury, they wanted to get something back out of it. They wanted to get the fame, they wanted to get the glory, they wanted to get the notoriety that came out of that. And the true notion of sacrifice is, what am I willing to give up in order to accomplish the purposes of the greater good? Let me tell you something right now. This is not just financial. And too many times when we talk about the story of the widow's mite or Ananias and Sappharia, we talk about it in purely financial terms, that you have to give everything. You have to give your money, give your money, give your money. That's not what I'm talking about. Because all of this stems from a mindset inside your heart of I see things that need to be taking place, I see things that need to be done, and I'm going to give up myself to help with that. The same situation happens if you're in a small congregation, 10, 15 people, and you've never led singing before. As a matter of fact, you can't carry a tune in 5 buckets. I don't know where that phrase came from. But you can't carry a tune, you're tone deaf, but you're the only male there. And as you look around, you realize there's one of two things that's going to happen. Number one, everyone's going to probably, not really, I don't mean that way. Nobody's going to laugh at you. But you're going to think to yourself, everyone's laughing at you because you're putting yourself out there. Or number two, the worship service ain't going to continue. And so one of those two things is going to happen. You either have to put your ego to the side and take part in that worship service. Put yourself out there. Sacrifice yourself. Or, that's just not going to get done. And in a much more everyday sense, when we look at our interpersonal relationships around everybody else, we may look at Joe, who is in abject poverty, who's on the side of the road and doesn't have the money to change his tire. This is not a true story, by the way. When we look at him, we think to ourselves, I'm on my way here, and if I stop, I have to give him money, I have to help him. That's just too much time out of my day. Sacrifice is being willing to lay parts of yourself on the altar to accomplish the greater good. And it by nature takes something out of you. And Ananias and Sappharia didn't want to do that. They wanted to give, sure, but they wanted to take a whole lot more back out of the treasury. 2 Samuel chapter 24 is one of the most interesting stories along these lines, because there's a statement that's made at the end of this that I think is very telling about what sacrifice is all about. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, this is the very last chapter, the very last book that describes David's life. It's very much at the end of his rope. And he's had a pretty checkered past. In 2 Samuel 24, it's not really any better, because he takes the census. One of those things that we also think, well, what's the big deal? Well, that's not a very big deal. But as his repentance, he was supposed to build an altar. This altar consisted of this threshing floor that he would then make these sacrifices towards God. That's where the story in chapter 24, verse 18 picks up. And it says, so Gad came to David that day and said to him, go up, erect an altar to the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David then went up according to the word of Gad, just as the Lord had commanded. And Araunah looked down and saw the king and his servants crossing over towards him. And Araunah went out and bowed his face to the ground before the king. This is the king of Israel showing up at your doorstep. And Araunah said to him, why has my lord the king come before his servant? David said, to buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be held back from the people. Keep in mind at this point that David, as the king of Israel, could have just waltzed in and taken it. He didn't have to have this whole exchange. Shows up with his posse, wipes everything out, offers his sacrifice, and moves on with his life. Araunah understands this. Verse 22, Araunah says to David, let my lord the king take and offer what is good in his sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yokes of oxen for the wood. Everything, O king, Araunah gives to the king. Very benevolent of Araunah. Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. However, the king said to Araunah, no, but I will surely buy from you for a price. If you underline or highlight this, a perfect passage for this. I will surely buy from you for a price. For I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. The nature of sacrifice is that it's a part of who you are. It's not enough for me to take something from one person, give it to somebody else, and say that's a sacrifice. Because that's not. What a sacrifice is taking something that's dear to you, something that's near to you, and offering it to something else. David understood that. And if David had just waltzed in, taken the threshing floor, offered his sacrifices, it wouldn't have meant anything. Because it didn't come from anything. That's the same way that Ananias and Sappharia were. It wasn't just that they were greedy. It wasn't just that they were selfish. It wasn't just that they wanted things. It was the fact that they wanted to take things from the congregation as a whole instead of just simply offering them to them. Every year, those of you who are familiar with this will probably understand this. Every year, the Iditarod race is ran in Alaska. If you are not familiar with the Iditarod, it's one of the most grueling examples of endurance that you'll ever find. 938 miles across the vast Alaskan interior. And it's been held every year since 1973. 1973 was the first year. The prizes, the races have continued to go on to this point. And it's a grueling instance. This is just, by the way, a map of how far it is. The winner, by the way, doesn't get anything that compares to how intense this is. You get some cash prizes. I think you get a pickup, which if it's a Ford, it very much is worth the sacrifice. But you have this huge cash prize. I see some very good nods. Thank you for that. The most recent winner, 2017, his name was Mitch Seavey. He had 2 dogs, Pilot and Chris. Finished that 938-mile race in 8 days, 3 hours, and 40 minutes. 8 days, 3 hours, 40 minutes. Keep in mind, that is in 2017 with dogs that are at the apex of their training, with the most recent technology, with 10 layers of North Face on, 8 days, 3 hours, and 40 minutes. And you would think, well, that's obviously the fastest that race could be run, or at least close. And it's not. There was one example of that race that was being run that blew that out of the water. It happened in 1925, when there was a 3-year-old boy at the very end of it. And if you can see this on the far, I'm trying to get this right, on this side, it's up here on this side, a little town called Nome, about 4,000 people. And this 3-year-old boy was diagnosed with diphtheria, which at that point was absolutely fatal. And so this little boy was diagnosed with diphtheria, but it was misdiagnosed at first. A lot of people didn't really know what it was about. Everybody kind of let it go. And then the little boy died. And then another little girl got sick. And everybody started to kind of get nervous at that point, because that's when they realized that diphtheria could be fatal, or is fatal, but could be contagious. And so what they realized in this far corner of Alaska is that if we don't get it under control, all of us are going to die. Looking at a fatality rate of 100% over a span of 10 to 15,000 people. And the only antidote was in Seattle at that point. That was the only antidote that they could find. But the trains were down, the roads were down, you couldn't fly at that point, at least in this type of climate. And so the question was, how are we going to get this antidote from point A to point C to save all these people? People got together. And they thought to themselves, instead of doing all these different things, we're going to have a relay team of race dogs. And these people are going to go from point A all the way to point Z, and they're going to pick it up and sprint as fast as they can, pick it up, sprint as fast as they can, and we're going to get that antidote to them. And keep in mind that in this time period, 1925, in January of 1925, the temperature had dropped to below freezing, negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You have pitch darkness in the Alaskan winter. You have abject pain, misery, all these different things. At the end of that week, they actually got that antidote from point A to point Z in 5.5 days. The antidote would last 6 total. But if you can imagine yourself sitting here as an Alaskan musher, and you don't know the town of Nome, you've never been there, and you're sitting there thinking, I'm going to pick this antidote up, I'm going to drive it 80 miles through the most miserable conditions on earth to save a whole bunch of people that I don't even know. And most of the names of the people that were in that relay race are all lost to history. But let me tell you something about those people. When you're driving through this type of climate, when you're doing this type of stuff, in this type of environment, that is sacrifice. That's putting your own comfort, that's putting your own happiness, that's putting your own life on the line to help somebody else. That wasn't what Ananias and Sappharia did. They did not have a mindset about the common good. They did not have a care in the world for anybody other than themselves. It didn't matter who was poor. It didn't matter that there were people that were sick. It didn't matter that there were people that were off, that were bad off. The only thing these people cared about was what they could do for themselves. Talk about Ananias and Sappharia. Their first sin, at least when you go a little bit deeper, number one, is that they put themselves above every other person that was in that group. And that's the real sin. If you go a little bit deeper, to me that's the real sin of Ananias and Sappharia. John the 13th chapter, Jesus gives them a great illustration of how they should act amongst each other. Keep in mind that when you're talking about the apostles, at least at this point, these are people that are jockeying for position, asking themselves, can I be the greatest in your kingdom? And Jesus does something in John the 13th chapter that's very peculiar, at least to the people that were there. In John chapter 13, starting verse 5, it says, he being Jesus poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. That's a slave's job. That is not the job for the master of the universe. And as these people are watching it, they obviously are very taken back by it. Verse 12 is where this whole situation gets back up. It says, "So when he had washed his feet, he took his garments and reclined at the table, and he said to them, 'Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I, then, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I also do. Truly, truly, I say to you,'" verse 16, "a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." What Jesus did in washing the disciples' feet was, and we take this for granted half the time, one of the greatest, and I would argue the greatest example of humility that has ever been demonstrated on the face of this earth. Because you have the creator of the universe, the one that spun the world into existence, the one who is sitting there in the flesh, who's walked on water, who's preached the Sermon on the Mount, who has raised the dead. And he looks at me, and he grabs a towel, and he places it over his arm, and he gets down on his knees, he takes this bucket of water, he pours it over your feet, and he begins to rub your feet to wash them of all the dirt that was on them. An extreme sense of humility formed by the creation or the creator of the universe to one of his creation. And as he reclines back at the table, he looks at them and says, "You know what I've done to you. You've seen what I did." This is the same thing that you're supposed to do to other people. Not in the sense of physically washing each other's feet. Not in the sense that every time somebody comes in, you get on your knees and you wash their feet. That'd be a very chaotic foyer every time somebody saw each other. But the idea is to put yourself in a position of humility to help somebody else. Your own ego is put in check. Your own pride is put in check for the betterment of the other person. And Jesus builds off this in John chapter 13. Look at verse 31. He builds on this by saying in verse 31, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you. A little while longer you will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going you cannot come. A new commandment," verse 34, "I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have also loved you." Keep in mind what was in full view for these people. "Even as I have loved you, you also love one another. And by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." One of the hallmarks of Christianity, and one of the hallmarks of our faith, is that we will go to the ends of the earth for one another. Saints helping saints. The same pattern we saw in Acts chapter 2, John chapter 5, is that we will go to the ends of the earth, do anything, give anything, be anything that our brethren need. And Ananias and Sappharia, as they were sitting there in Acts chapter 5, did not think about it in those terms. They thought, I can give this great sum of money, I can lie about how much I really did, I keep some back for that new car that I want, or that new chariot that I'm after, and then I can just make this grand claim that I gave everything. And rake in not only the things in the back end, the financial gain, but also the praise and the glory of everybody. And they sought to take from those people in order to build up their own pride. And in doing so, they put themselves above everything else. But that wasn't it. They also put themselves above God. There are certain people in this world who will look at the church as a means to an end, the same way that Ananias and Sappharia did. And there will be people that will look at the church and think to themselves, not what can I offer the church, but what can the church offer me? And those people, Jude talks about as being false teachers, people who are in it for good. Paul calls them in the book of Philippians, people that are doing it out of spite, people that use the church, who preach the gospel for means of personal gain. And in Luke chapter 17, Jesus, I think, issues one of the greatest statements about what our role here on this earth is. Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 7, he says, "Which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he has come in from the field, 'Come immediately and sit down and eat'? But will he not also say to him, 'Prepare something for me to eat, properly clothe yourself, serve me while I eat and drink. Afterward, then you may eat and drink'? He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he?" Verse 10, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded, you say, 'We are unworthy slaves, we have done only that which we ought to have done.'" Make no mistake about what Jesus is talking about here. If we go out and change the entire world, if we go out into Greenville and convert every single last person in this town, we still are obligated to say the exact same thing he said in verse 10, which is we are unprofitable servants. We've simply done what was our duty to do. If we go out and change the world, if we convert 1,000 people, if we give our bodies to be burned, if we do everything like that, we still have no right to look at God and say, look at how great I am. Look at all the things that I've done. Because when we say that, we miss all the things that He's done for us. And far be it from any of us to look at the church as a means for a prideful end, as a means for financial gain, or as any other purpose besides the holy purpose that it was meant to be in the beginning. And Ananias and Sappharia, when they looked at this whole scene unfold before them, this vast community that existed, and they saw the praise that came from giving all that you owned, they put themselves above God by using His church as a means to advance themselves. And I would also argue, this one you can argue with me if you want to, I would also argue Ananias and Sappharia put themselves above each other. That is to say, Ananias puts himself above Sappharia. That Sappharia put herself above him. Because make no mistake, when they both went into this, and the text is very clear in the first few verses of Acts chapter 5, when they both went into this, they both knew what they were doing. They both knew that it was sinful. And it should have been contingent on one of them to say to themselves, well, maybe we should do this because if nothing else, it's wrong. Because it's sinful, because it's thievery, because it's braggadocious, because it's all these things. But neither one of them did that. And both of them looked at the situation and said, I want to do this, but I need your help. If one of them dropped the ball, the other one was going to be caught too. So we need both of us to push forward with this lie, with this deception. And in doing so, they put their own good above that of their spouse. When they said to themselves, we will lie for each other. Look at Luke the 17th chapter. The first few verses of this. Luke chapter 17, starting verse 1. If you're still in chapter 17, it'll help. Just look a couple of verses up. Luke chapter 17, starting verse 1. He says, he said to his disciples, it's inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck, and he were then thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble. Be on your guard, for if your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day, returns you 7 times a day, and you repent, forgive him. One of the worst things that we can do in this life, and this goes for everybody, whether you're talking about married couples in this case or whatever, one of the worst things that we can be for each other is a stumbling block. And especially one of the worst things we can do is help to encourage other people to sin. When Ananias walked up to Sappharia and said, this is what I think we should do, we can keep a little money, we can get the praise, this is what I think we should do, Sappharia should have been quick to say no. Because if nothing else, even if we don't drop it on the spot, Ananias, it will cost us our souls if we don't repent. And vice versa with Sapphiria and Ananias. They have a responsibility to look out for each other. And you see the exact same thing in Genesis, the 3rd chapter. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve are discussing, or mostly Eve is looking at the tree, and she sees that it's good, she likes it. What does she do? Knowing that it's wrong, gives the fruit and gives it to her husband. And he, following her example, eat, and they're both condemned. We have a responsibility to each other, to look out for one another, to not put our own selves above each other, and to say, will you help me engage in this sin? It's uncomfortable for me to talk to you about this sin, so I'm just not going to. We have to be willing, even in the most intimate of relationships, to put the other person above ourselves, and to put ourselves last in that totem pole of the hierarchy. This story, when you read Acts chapter 5, sounds very similar to another story that you read about in Leviticus, the 10th chapter. And there you have Nadab and Abihu, 2 sons that are of Aaron. And Aaron knew what he should have done. He knew where to get the fire, he knew where to get the sacrifice, he knew how to set up the altar, he knew all those things. And by proxy, so did Nadab and Abihu. And Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, those 2 very short verses, Nadab and Abihu take what is called strange fire, they put it on the altar, and instantly they are consumed. And we look at that, we think about it much in the same way that we look at Acts chapter 5. How hard of God, how wrathful, how vengeful of God that he would do something like that. Aaron isn't even allowed to cry for his sons, which after Logan and Hannah came around, I have a whole new appreciation for. But there's a phrase in verse 3 that typifies exactly why they weren't there, and why he wasn't allowed to cry, and why the fire came out from heaven and consumed them. God responds back to Moses, God responds to Aaron, and says, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people, I will be honored. When we come into the domain of God, when we come into His presence, whether you're talking about a corporate sense in the building, or just in general, everyday life, when we approach Him in prayer, when we approach Him in any way, we come before Him as the holy and the almighty God that He is. Not seeking to shave things off the back end for my own personal gain. Not trying to line up things so that I can be holy and, oh yeah, something else. By everybody, by everything, by all of creation, God will be regarded as holy. That's a lesson Nadab and Abihu learned the hard way, and Ananias and Sapphiria learned the hard way as well. This has been a kind of an intense lesson. I don't want to give anybody the idea here this morning that God is unloving, that He's unkind, that He's inhospitable. The very fact that we're sitting here this morning speaks to His patience for every one of us. And I would encourage every single one of us this morning to look into your own souls, to look into your own hearts and ask yourself, is there something I'm overlooked? Is there something that I haven't seen that I need to make right? And whether that involves baptism by being washed for the forgiveness of your sins, or whether that involves asking for the prayers of the congregation, I would encourage you to do it right now before it's everlastingly too late. Just because God hasn't struck us down on the spot doesn't mean that He's happy with our lives if they're lived in rebellion to Him. I would encourage you to make that right. Do it now.
Let me bear and to share some